In the winter of 1864, Pastor David Ashworth discovered something in the basement of Ashenwood Methodist Church that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Hidden beneath decades of dust and forgotten hymnals, he found a bell rope that had been deliberately cut. When he asked the church elders why the bell hadn't rung in 5 years, their faces turned ashen, and they spoke of blood that dripped from the bronze whenever someone dared to pull that rope. But before we uncover the terrible truth that Pastor Ashworth found in those forbidden church records, if you're drawn to stories of dark secrets hidden within sacred walls, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share mysteries that few dare to tell, stories that will make you question what really happens behind closed doors. Also, let us know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts around the world. Now, let's step back into that cold Illinois winter and discover what Pastor Ashworth was about to uncover. The story that reached Pastor Ashworth through whispered conversations and old church records suggests that the mystery began 5 years earlier, in the bloody autumn of 1859. Ashenwood, Illinois, sat like a forgotten prayer book in the rolling farmlands 40 miles southwest of Springfield. In 1864, this community of barely 800 souls bore the weight of a nation at war. Confederate and Union sympathizers lived side by side, their political differences simmering beneath the veneer of Christian fellowship. The town's single main street hosted 3 churches, 2 general stores, and a handful of modest homes that housed families whose sons had marched off to battlefields with names that would echo through history: Gettysburg, Antietam, Bull Run. The Ashenwood Methodist Church stood at the town's heart, its white wooden steeple piercing the gray November sky like an accusatory finger. Built in 1847 with donations from local farming families, the church had served as sanctuary, community center, and moral compass for 17 years. Its bronze bell, cast by the Manili Bell Company of Troy, New York, had called faithful souls to worship every Sunday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, its clear tone carrying across the prairie for miles, until it stopped. Pastor David Ashworth had arrived in Ashenwood on November 15, 1864, carrying little more than his theological degree from Garrett Biblical Institute and a determination to serve God in whatever capacity the Methodist Episcopal Church required. At 32, he possessed the earnest demeanor of a man who believed deeply in redemption and the power of honest work. His predecessor, Pastor Edmund Cartwright, had died suddenly of pneumonia the previous spring, leaving behind a congregation that seemed perpetually nervous and a mystery that no one wanted to discuss. The church building itself reflected the community's modest prosperity. Hand-hewn oak pews, donated by the Thornton family's sawmill, seated nearly 200 congregants. Tall windows of clear glass, colored glass being considered too Catholic for Methodist sensibilities, allowed autumn light to paint geometric patterns across the worn wooden floors. A small pump organ, purchased with funds raised through church suppers and donation drives, provided accompaniment for hymns sung with the particular intensity of people seeking comfort in uncertain times. But it was the silence above that troubled Pastor Ashworth most. Every morning, he would look up at the bell tower and wonder why such an essential part of church life had been abandoned. When he asked Mrs. Sarah Wickham, the church treasurer and unofficial keeper of congregational memory, she had wrung her hands and spoken of unfortunate circumstances that made the bell unsuitable for holy purposes. Her husband, Thomas Wickham, who owned the largest general store in town, had been even less forthcoming, suggesting only that Pastor Ashworth focus on more pressing spiritual matters. The congregation itself reflected the complex loyalties of a border community during wartime. The Thornton family, whose sawmill provided much of the church's lumber, had sent 2 sons to fight for the Union, while the Prescott family, owners of the town's grain elevator, made no secret of their Confederate sympathies. These tensions never erupted into open conflict within the church walls, but Pastor Ashworth could sense them in the careful way families seated themselves, in the pointed omissions during prayer requests, and in the way conversations died when he approached groups of whispering parishioners. It was during his third week in Ashenwood that Pastor Ashworth first heard about the blood. December 6, 1864, brought the first heavy snowfall of the winter, and with it, a conversation that would change everything. Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, a 70-year-old widow whose sharp eyes missed nothing in Ashenwood, had lingered after the evening prayer service. As Pastor Ashworth extinguished the oil lamps one by one, she spoke in the careful tone of someone unburdening a long-held secret. "Pastor," she began, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather Bible, "there's something you ought to know about that bell of ours." She gestured toward the ceiling, where the rope that should have hung down to ring the bell had been cut short, its frayed end tied off against the wall. "It ain't been rung for 5 years come this February, and there's good reason for that." Pastor Ashworth set down the lamp and gave her his full attention. Mrs. Prescott had lived in Ashenwood longer than anyone else in the congregation, and her husband had been one of the church's founding members before his death in a farming accident 10 years prior. 5 years ago, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, young Timothy Morrison, he was only 16 then, decided to ring that bell for Sunday service when Pastor Cartwright took ill. The boy grabbed hold of that rope and gave it a mighty pull, same as had been done every Sunday since the church was built. She paused, her eyes fixed on some distant memory. But when that bell started to ring, Pastor, something else started to drip. The old woman's description sent a chill through Pastor Ashworth that had nothing to do with the December cold seeping through the church walls. According to Mrs. Prescott, drops of what appeared to be blood had begun falling from the bell tower within moments of the ringing. Not a few drops, but a steady dripping that stained the wooden floor of the sanctuary and filled the air with a metallic scent that made several congregants violently ill. Timothy himself came down from that bell tower, white as church linen, Mrs. Prescott continued, said there was blood on his hands, blood on the rope, blood everywhere he looked. Pastor Cartwright sent everyone home and spent the rest of that Sunday up in the tower with Thomas Wickham and Henry Thornton, cleaning up whatever mess they found. Pastor Ashworth felt his throat tighten. What did they discover up there? Mrs. Prescott's response came after a long pause, as if she were weighing the wisdom of her words. "They never said, Pastor." But the next Sunday, Pastor Cartwright announced that the bell had developed a mechanical difficulty and would no longer be used for services. That rope's been tied off ever since, and not a soul in this congregation has spoken of ringing it again. As if summoned by their conversation, the church door opened with a gust of snow-laden wind. Thomas Wickham stepped inside, stamping his boots and shaking ice from his coat. His appearance at that moment seemed more than coincidental, and Pastor Ashworth noticed the sharp look that passed between Wickham and Mrs. Prescott. "Eleanor," Wickham said with forced cheerfulness, "I hope you're not filling our new pastor's head with old stories. We've got enough real troubles to occupy our prayers without dwelling on past difficulties." The dismissive tone in Wickham's voice only strengthened Pastor Ashworth's determination to understand what had really happened in that bell tower. After Mrs. Prescott and Mr. Wickham left, together, Pastor Ashworth noted, he spent another hour in the church, staring up at the cut rope and trying to imagine what could cause a bronze bell to bleed. Over the following weeks, Pastor Ashworth began to piece together fragments of Ashenwood's recent history, and what he discovered painted a disturbing picture of a community living with a terrible secret. The more he inquired about the bell incident, the more he realized that February 1859 had been a turning point for more than just the church. That same month, several of Ashenwood's most prominent families had suddenly displayed newfound prosperity. Thomas Wickham had expanded his general store, adding a second building and importing goods from as far away as Chicago. Henry Thornton had purchased new equipment for his sawmill and acquired an additional 100 acres of prime farmland. Even Pastor Cartwright had somehow found the funds to add a small addition to the church parsonage. But it was a conversation with Dr. James Morton, the town's physician, and one of the few residents who seemed willing to speak candidly about the past, that provided Pastor Ashworth with his first real clue about what might have happened. Dr. Morton, a Union Army veteran who had returned to Ashenwood after serving as a field surgeon at Shiloh, possessed the particular gravity of a man who had seen too much death. On a bitter January evening in 1865, he visited Pastor Ashworth at the parsonage, ostensibly to discuss the spiritual needs of wounded soldiers being treated at the improvised hospital he had established in the town's old schoolhouse. "Pastor, Doctor," Morton said as they sat before the parsonage fireplace, "there's something about this town that troubles my conscience, and I believe it should trouble yours as well." He paused to sip from a cup of coffee that had grown cold during their conversation. "In my experience as a battlefield surgeon, I became intimately familiar with the scent of blood. Old blood, fresh blood, the particular odor that clings to metal that has been stained with human gore." Pastor Ashworth felt his stomach tighten as he sensed where this conversation was leading. "On February 12, 1859, Dr. Morton continued, I was called to the church to examine several congregants who had become ill during what should have been a routine Sunday service. The smell that filled that sanctuary that day was unmistakable. It was the smell of old blood, Pastor. Blood that had been heated and liquefied, as if by intense flame. The physician's words hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Dr. Morton leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I served in this community for 3 years before the war, Pastor, and I can tell you with certainty that several families in this congregation came into unexpected wealth during the winter of 1858 and 1859. Wealth that coincided with reports of Confederate supply trains being robbed throughout central Illinois." Pastor Ashworth set down his own coffee cup with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. "Dr. Morton, are you suggesting that members of this congregation were involved in highway robbery?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Pastor. I'm telling you what I observed with my own eyes and what my experience as a battlefield surgeon tells me about the scent of blood on metal." "Doctor." Morton stood to leave, pulling on his heavy winter coat. "But I will say this. If you decide to investigate that bell tower, you might want to examine not just the bell itself, but any records that Pastor Cartwright might have kept regarding church finances during that period." As Dr. Morton reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Be careful, Pastor. There are people in this town who have worked very hard to forget what happened 5 years ago, and they may not appreciate your curiosity about matters they consider buried." Pastor Ashworth's investigation began in earnest the following morning. Armed with Dr. Morton's troubling suggestions and his own growing conviction that something deeply wrong had occurred in his church, he decided to examine Pastor Cartwright's personal records, which had been stored in the church basement since his death. The basement of Ashenwood Methodist Church served as storage for everything from old hymnals to Christmas decorations, but in the far corner, beneath a canvas tarp covered with dust and mouse droppings, Pastor Ashworth discovered 3 wooden crates containing Pastor Cartwright's personal effects. The first 2 crates held the expected items: theological books, sermon notes, correspondence with Methodist Episcopal Church officials in Springfield. But the third crate contained something that made Pastor Ashworth's blood run cold: a leather-bound ledger with private records written in Pastor Cartwright's careful script across the cover. The ledger documented transactions that had nothing to do with normal church business. Beginning in December 1858 and continuing through March 1859, Pastor Cartwright had recorded a series of deposits and expenses that painted a picture of criminal enterprise disguised as Christian charity. Entries like materials acquired from travelers, 847, and metalwork consultation, 156, appeared alongside carefully coded references to Confederate merchandise and battlefield acquisitions. But it was an entry dated February 8, 1859, that confirmed Pastor Ashworth's worst fears. Bell recasting project complete. Original bronze supplemented with acquired materials totaling 47 pounds of gold. J. Henderson, metalworker, received final payment of $200. All participants sworn to secrecy regarding source of materials. Pastor Ashworth sat in the dim basement light, reading and rereading that entry until its implications became undeniable. The church bell hadn't developed a mechanical difficulty. It had been recast using gold stolen from Confederate soldiers, quite possibly taken from dead men on battlefields. The blood that had dripped when young Timothy Morrison rang the bell hadn't been a supernatural phenomenon. It had been evidence of a crime so heinous that it defied Christian comprehension. Further entries in the ledger revealed the scope of the operation. Thomas Wickham had served as the group's treasurer, using his general store as a front for selling stolen goods throughout central Illinois. Henry Thornton had provided transportation through his lumber wagons, which traveled regularly between Ashenwood and other communities. Pastor Cartwright himself had used his position and reputation to provide legitimacy to the operation, blessing their activities as provision for the righteous in times of trial. The ledger contained names that read like a roster of Ashenwood's most respected families: the Wickhams, the Thorntons, the Prescotts, and even the Morrisons, young Timothy's own family. It documented a systematic operation of robbing Confederate supply trains and, more horrifically, looting the bodies of dead soldiers for gold teeth, jewelry, and personal effects that could be melted down and sold. As Pastor Ashworth continued reading, he discovered that the bell recasting had been meant as the operation's crowning achievement. The stolen gold would be incorporated into an object of sacred purpose, hiding the evidence of their crimes while creating a permanent reminder of their victory over the enemies of the Union. But something had gone wrong during the recasting process. An entry dated February 15, 1859, revealed the disaster. Bell project requires immediate cessation. J. Henderson reports that human blood mixed with the gold during the melting process cannot be fully removed from the metal. When heated by friction from bell rope, the bronze releases drops of reddish fluid that carries the unmistakable scent of gore. All involved parties agree that the bell must never again be rung, and the truth of its creation must be concealed permanently. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Pastor Ashworth faced a moral crisis that went to the very heart of his calling. He held in his hands evidence of war crimes committed by the leaders of his own congregation, crimes that had literally been cast into the very bell that should have called the faithful to worship. The blood that had dripped 5 years ago hadn't been divine judgment or supernatural punishment. It had been the physical remainder of murdered men, incorporated into bronze through the incompetence of a hired metal worker who hadn't known how to properly separate blood from stolen gold. But before he could decide how to act on this knowledge, Pastor Ashworth realized that his investigation had not gone unnoticed. On the morning of February 3, 1865, he arrived at the church to find Thomas Wickham waiting in the sanctuary, along with Henry Thornton and 2 other men Pastor Ashworth didn't recognize. "Pastor," Wickham said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we understand you've been spending considerable time reviewing old church records. As members of the church board, we thought it might be helpful to discuss any questions you might have about our congregation's history." Pastor Ashworth felt the weight of the ledger in his coat pocket like a stone. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but I assure you that my research is simply part of my effort to better understand this community and its needs." Henry Thornton stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the sanctuary floor. "Pastor, we've heard that you've been asking questions about our bell. That's a matter that was settled years ago under Pastor Cartwright's leadership, and we'd prefer not to revisit old troubles." The threat in Thornton's voice was unmistakable, but Pastor Ashworth had committed himself to discovering the full truth. "Mr. Thornton, if there are matters concerning this church that affect its spiritual health, then as pastor, I have both the right and the responsibility to address them." One of the strangers, a thin man with the weathered look of someone who spent his time on horseback, spoke for the first time. "Pastor, sometimes the health of a community depends on letting old wounds heal without poking at them. You seem like a decent man, and decent men sometimes live longer when they focus on present concerns rather than past difficulties." The implication was clear, but Pastor Ashworth had spent too many sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience to back down now. "Gentlemen, I believe this conversation has gone far enough. I'll ask you to leave the church now, so that I can prepare for this evening's prayer service." As the 4 men filed out, Thomas Wickham paused at the door. "Pastor, we hope you'll reconsider your current course of action. Ashenwood is a peaceful community, and we'd hate to see that peace disrupted by unnecessary complications." That evening, Pastor Ashworth made a decision that would define the remainder of his ministry. Rather than confronting the congregation directly or attempting to involve law enforcement, which he realized might include sympathizers or participants in the original crimes, he chose a different course of action. If the physical evidence of their crimes was hidden in the bell, then he would expose that evidence in a way that couldn't be denied or covered up. After the evening prayer service, Pastor Ashworth remained in the church until well past midnight, preparing for what he knew might be his final act as pastor of Ashenwood Methodist Church. Using a ladder from the church storage room, he climbed into the bell tower and examined the bell itself for the first time since his arrival in the community. The bronze surface showed signs of amateur recasting, irregular coloration, visible seam lines where the metal had been poorly mixed, and most tellingly, dark stains around the bell's rim that no amount of cleaning had been able to remove. When Pastor Ashworth held his oil lamp close to these stains, he could detect the faint but unmistakable scent that Dr. Morton had described, the smell of old blood embedded in heated metal. Sunday, February 12, 1865, marked exactly 6 years since the bell had last been rung, and Pastor Ashworth had decided that this anniversary would see its secret finally revealed. He had spent the previous week preparing a sermon unlike any he had ever delivered, one that would expose the truth about the bell while calling his congregation to repentance for their silence in the face of evil. The sanctuary filled with its usual crowd of farmers and their families, shop owners and their wives, children fidgeting in their Sunday clothes while snow fell softly outside the tall windows. Thomas Wickham sat in his customary pew near the front, flanked by Henry Thornton and several other men whose names appeared in Pastor Cartwright's ledger. Mrs. Prescott occupied her usual seat, her sharp eyes fixed on Pastor Ashworth with an expression of nervous anticipation. Pastor Ashworth began his service normally, leading the congregation through familiar hymns and prayers. But when the time came for his sermon, he stepped not to the pulpit, but to the center of the sanctuary, directly beneath the cut bell rope. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "Today marks the 6th anniversary of an event that changed the spiritual life of this congregation forever. Today, I believe, God calls us to confront the truth about that event and the terrible secret that has poisoned our fellowship for far too long." A murmur of unease rippled through the congregation. Thomas Wickham half rose from his pew, but Pastor Ashworth continued before he could speak. 6 years ago, this bell was recast using gold stolen from the dead and dying soldiers of our nation's conflict. Gold taken from men who died far from home, whose families never learned what became of their personal effects, whose blood was quite literally incorporated into the metal of this bell through the carelessness of those who commissioned its recasting. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several congregation members leaped to their feet, shouting denials and accusations. Henry Thornton started toward the front of the church, his face dark with rage. But Pastor Ashworth had prepared for this moment. "I have in my possession Pastor Cartwright's complete records of this operation," he announced, producing the leather ledger from beneath the pulpit. "Records that document not only the theft of Confederate gold and personal effects, but the systematic looting of battlefield dead by members of this very congregation." Mrs. Wickham began weeping loudly, while her husband's face had gone ashen. Other congregation members looked around in shock and confusion, realizing for the first time the extent of what had been hidden from them. Pastor Ashworth opened the ledger and began reading specific entries, naming names and detailing amounts that left no room for denial. Thomas Wickham, church treasurer, received $1,247 from the sale of Confederate officers' jewelry acquired at Carthage battlefield. Henry Thornton, transportation, collected $856 for moving stolen goods through lumber wagon operations. William Morrison, $234 received for acquisition of gold teeth from battlefield dead. As he read, Pastor Ashworth noticed that many congregation members were hearing these details for the first time. The conspiracy had involved only a core group of families, while the broader community had been kept ignorant of the true scope of their crimes. "The bell above us," Pastor Ashworth continued, "cannot ring without weeping the blood of murdered men. When heated by the friction of the rope, the improperly mixed bronze releases the physical remains of human beings whose only crime was fighting for a cause they believed in. Every Sunday for 6 years, we have worshipped beneath a monument to greed and sacrilege." Thomas Wickham finally found his voice. "Pastor, you don't understand the circumstances of the war. We did what we had to do to support the Union cause." "Mr. Wickham," Pastor Ashworth replied, his voice echoing through the now silent sanctuary, "what you did was desecrate the dead for personal profit. What you created was not a symbol of Union victory but evidence of your own moral defeat." The aftermath of Pastor Ashworth's revelation transformed Ashenwood forever, though not in the way he had hoped. Within hours of the service, Thomas Wickham, Henry Thornton, and 3 other named conspirators had left town with their families, taking whatever portable wealth they could carry. By the following Sunday, Pastor Ashworth found himself preaching to a congregation of less than 50 people, as families either fled in shame or refused to associate with a church that had harbored such secrets. The bell itself was eventually removed and sold for scrap metal to a foundry in Springfield, though Pastor Ashworth made certain that the purchaser was informed of its history. The money from its sale was donated to a fund for Union soldiers' widows and orphans, a gesture that provided little comfort but seemed the only appropriate response to the crimes it represented. Pastor Ashworth remained in Ashenwood for another 3 years, ministering to a greatly diminished but spiritually renewed congregation. He never married, and those who knew him best said that the weight of what he had discovered in that basement ledger had changed him fundamentally. He aged rapidly, developing the haunted look of a man who had seen too clearly into the darkness of human nature. In his final sermon before leaving Ashenwood in 1868, Pastor Ashworth reflected on the lessons learned from the bell that could not ring without bleeding. "We tell ourselves," he said to the small group of faithful who had remained, "that evil committed in service of a good cause is somehow transformed into righteousness. But evil remains evil, regardless of the flags we drape over it or the prayers we say above it. The dead deserve our respect, not our greed, and the truth deserves our courage, not our silence." The Methodist Episcopal Church eventually assigned a new pastor to Ashenwood, but the building itself was sold in 1872 and converted to a grain storage facility. The congregation that had once numbered in the hundreds never recovered from the revelation of what some of its most respected members had done in the name of patriotism and profit. Years later, when the Civil War had become history and the wounds of the nation had begun to heal, visitors to Ashenwood would sometimes ask longtime residents about the old Methodist church and its missing bell. Most would claim no knowledge of why the building had been abandoned or what had become of its bronze bell. But elderly residents, those who had been present on that February morning in 1865, would sometimes speak of a pastor who had chosen truth over comfort, and a bell that had bled the sins of those who had cast it. The truth about the Ashenwood bell serves as a reminder that the worst evils are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who convince themselves that their cause justifies their crimes. In the end, the bell's silence became more eloquent than any sermon Pastor Ashworth ever preached, a wordless testimony to the price of moral compromise and the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths, even when they threaten everything we thought we knew about those we trusted most. The fate of Thomas Wickham, Henry Thornton, and the other conspirators remains unknown. They vanished into the chaos of post-war America, carrying their secrets and their stolen wealth to graves that no church bell would ever mark. But their legacy lived on in the memory of a small Illinois community that learned too late that respect for the dead and commitment to truth matter more than patriotic fervor or material prosperity. For Pastor David Ashworth, the lesson was both simpler and more profound. Sometimes the greatest service a minister can provide is not comfort for the living, but justice for the dead, even when that justice comes at the cost of everything he holds dear.